All right, what's up, everybody? Today we're going to be discussing MG Chemicals 422C versus 422B. Before I get too deep into this, I just need to disclaim that I'm not a scientist. This wasn't done in a hyper-controlled lab. However, I would argue that this is in a more controlled environment than what most people have access to. I cycle the air about 5 to 6 times an hour. It's humidity controlled, all that jazz. Everything that I'm going to be discussing is publicly available data, and then MG Chemicals' response to my questions. So before anything else, let's get right into this. Okay, just a quick history lesson here. MG Chemicals 422B was released sometime around 2012, according to my research. It began circulating in our community around 2013 to 15. It starts taking off with the community pretty heavily around 2017 to 2018. After that period of time, 422C is released. It's marketed as the lower cost, cheaper alternative with similar performance to 422B due to the increase in cost for the raw materials. After that, we still see a lot of videos and instructional content regarding MG Chemicals. However, most of this content is using 422B, and you can tell by the green label on the bottle as well as the brush inside of the cap. So this is a quick test that I did here using a standard HB2 pencil. I did trim this down just because there's a lot that we're talking about. So this is a heavily used ESC that had a lot of thermal cycles going through it. You can see it kind of looked like crap. So everything was kind of already cracking. And as you can see, I can just take the pencil here and with a little bit of force, not even, just at a 45-degree angle, standard downward, it cracks off the conformal coating. That's not graphite or lead that you're seeing. It's actually the conformal coating popping off. It just kind of shatters like glass here in this example. Next example, this is another pencil test. This is on a freshly coated board that I let cure for 50% longer than is required, just using the pencil test. This was coated twice in a traditional way that FPV pilots might coat something. And on even the first try with no effort at all, as you can see, it just separates itself from the board, immediately starts cracking. So this next test is interesting. Exact same thing with a number 2 HB pencil. This board was actually dip coated once to be as thin and as precise as possible. Also allowed to cure for 50% longer curing time, and I found that this one was almost even worse. It was easier to crack off, and the interesting thing in this situation is after the debris in this situation has been cleaned away, it's not inherently obvious that the board is actually damaged. Because the coating is so thin and so clear and so well applied, you can't necessarily see that this is actually missing its conformal coating. And so when we throw this under the UV torch, you can actually see all of the areas that I just scratched are entirely now missing their coating. Now moving on to other examples that I was able to find online of this issue. We have a couple failures here on the right. This is pretty brutal. This looks absolutely awful. This user reported that they were flying outside in colder conditions, which absolutely makes sense as to why it looks like this, which I'll explain in the next couple slides. User on the left here indicated that this wasn't put under any sort of thermal load, and they're having the exact same failure. The thread indicates that they reached out to MG Chemicals and that instead of sending them the new model or variant 422C, they actually sent them 422B, which is an interesting use case for this. Next slide. I did a quick search on Amazon for the terms chip, brittle, and crack for 422C and 422B. I was able to find several different reviews regarding this. You can pause this and read here regarding that. And then moving on to 422B, using the exact same search terms, I found absolutely nothing. I wasn't able to find anything on Into FPV, Reddit, Amazon. Could not find any reports of 422B cracking in this scenario. Next, we're going to move on to the TDS documents comparing 422C and 422B. These are pretty much identical. The only thing I want to bring to attention here is 422B. The original liquid has excellent corrosion resistance. 422C claims that it is corrosion resistant, which off the bat isn't exactly something that we want to be reading when we're going to be flying these in snow, moisture, landing on dew grass, etc. So take that how you will. The next slide is the next page of the TDS document. We're going to start from the bottom and work our way to the top, so this makes a little bit more sense. The glass transition temperature is when the coating will actually phase change. The temperature is pretty much identical for these, 31 versus 29. The amount of thermal load that we're putting these boards underneath, this difference is basically negligible. The next thing underneath here we have is the coefficient of thermal expansion, which is how much the material is going to expand under heat. You'll notice that 422B expands significantly more than 422C, which inherently sounds like a bad thing, but this is not necessarily bad, because if we come back up to the top here, the binder system for 422B is silicone, which is exactly what you would expect. It's stretchy, it's malleable, it will form. The binder system for 422C is acrylic. So what I believe is happening here is when our boards are undergoing thermal stress, any small amount of expansion, even if it's barely measurable, is ultimately cracking this acrylic binder system and causing it to separate from the board. And that's what's causing this sugar-looking effect after even just a few cycles, especially on the ESC that I showed at the start, which is undergoing a lot more expansion and then contraction. That's why we're having large flakes of it pop off. This is a secondary test of the MG Chemicals 422C that I've applied to both sides of this silicone wire here. So all I did was I just put a thin, even coat on both sides of this here, and I haven't even let this fully cure yet. It has not been 24 hours, so it should be more malleable than it would be if it was fully cured. And now we're going to punch in a little bit on this here, and I'm going to try to get you guys a good angle. And then all I'm going to do is I'm just going to bend this. Boom. As you can see, this is cracking entirely, no longer coating the wire. So what these tests have led me to conclude is that 422C is significantly more brittle and much more prone to failure with our electronics than the traditional 422B. If the coating is not applied perfectly, then the chance of failure skyrockets. And the reason for that is any bubbles, any whatsoever, even one, that turns into basically a small glass sphere that the second it undergoes any sort of thermal expansion, any physical stress, will crack, and then that crack will then radiate throughout the board, causing enormous chunks to fall off of the PCB. I do also want to throw out that not every single board that I've ever used 422C on has failed. The only examples of this, though, that I could find were boards that basically don't undergo any heat. Specifically on the Mamba AIO from around 2022, the bottom side of that PCB has no heat generating parts to it whatsoever, and the top side has a very, very thick heat sink with its daughter board attached. So the bottom side of that actually looks totally fine compared to the other examples that I've shown. Although the use case for us, where most of our electronics have heat generating elements on both sides, this doesn't apply to most situations. So If you have used it, you can double check with a UV torch to see if your coating is still applied, and you might have gotten away with it, but I wouldn't necessarily count on it. All right, and that brings me to the final portion of the video. I reached out to MG Chemicals regarding this issue. I asked them to advise if there had been any formula changes or if they'd received similar reports. I did hear back from them, which shout out to MG, I really did appreciate. And without showing that on screen, just for privacy, they explained to me that they have received similar reports of this nature from other users, and that the 422C chemical is under review, and they requested that we pivot to 422B if possible until the issue is resolved. So, with that being said, we should pivot back to 422B. It is currently being phased out of production, is my understanding. I could be wrong about that. There appears to be very limited stock available if you can even find it. I do see additional stock incoming when I've checked certain retailers, so I don't believe it's entirely out of production, although it has been significantly reduced and it's not as readily available. It's not on Amazon. If you are in the US, I was able to procure some from Digikey, so we will have to see how that goes. I will be redoing these tests under the same methodology with 422B once it arrives, so stay tuned for part 2 when I do that, and I'll catch you guys next time. Take care.